Welcome to this event hosted by the Atlantic Council. My name is Hope Hodge-Seck. I am a journalist, and it's an honor to be here as part of the panel today and speaking with all of you about this truly remarkable collaborative effort to rescue the mother of a U.S. soldier from unspeakably dire conditions in Gaza. As you'll hear, this operation, which took place over the Christmas and New Year's holidays, required almost 24/7 involvement for some of these panelists, as they worked across time zones and stayed in close daily contact with Zahra Skak and her sons in the US. Ultimately, Zahra and her brother-in-law Fareed were able to safely leave the country and cross into Egypt on December 31st, New Year's Eve. As a journalist who had a front seat to all of this and was able to ultimately tell the story of this rescue for the Washington Post, I found the work and the drive of these veterans to accomplish the mission simply remarkable. I had a brief chat a little while ago with Ben Clay, who's on this panel, and was expressing my amazement at the time and effort that he had contributed. He told me very simply that he was just doing what he would want someone to do for his mother if she were in trouble. And that's the ethos of this group in a nutshell. On this panel today, we have Alex Plitzas, a former Army Psychological Operations and Chief of Sensitive Activities Office for the Secretary of Defense and former member of the White House Hostage Policy Review Team, as well as a current non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. We also have Danielle Cosgrove, a former United Nations High Commission for Refugees officer, who continues to meet regularly with relevant stakeholders across the US and government, including the Department of State, the National Security Council, and the Department of Defense. We also have Benjamin Clay, former Army Special Forces soldier and a former McKinsey consultant with a 25-year background in technology, media, and telecom. Also, Brian Thompson, a 28-year Army veteran in Green Beret, who is currently assigned as a senior special operations instructor with the Joint Special Operations University in Tampa. And finally, we have Omar Rafiq, a former Marine United States Special Operations Command Raider, who served as a special evacuations coordinator in Kabul during Afghanistan's 2021 evacuation. Frankly, I could spend an hour reading the full bios of these individuals, so please forgive the brevity here and feel free to check them out for yourself. Before we dive into the account of this specific rescue effort, I want to set the table for this conversation by reaching back to 2021 and the evacuation of US allies from Afghanistan. This was really the first time we saw this phenomenon of veterans working tirelessly on their own initiative to help bring Afghans who supported the US military safely to the States. For those of you who played a role in 2021, could you talk about that role and what you learned from that experience and how the skills and connections developed in that effort created a foundation for this? And additionally, I would love if you could spend some time talking about your own personal motivation for taking the time, taking the effort, and all of the things that go into humanitarian rescue missions like this and why that matters to you and why that's something that you prioritize in your life. Alex, let's go ahead and start with you.
Thanks, Hope. And it's nice to have the rest of the team here. Normally, I'm a spokesman for Special Operations Association of America, which is the umbrella organization we were operating under. So having the rest of the teammates here who were, actively working the operation, who are usually in the shadows, and having them be able to come and address this publicly is quite a nice treat for me to not be by myself. So I can't tell you how incredible that was to work with these folks again. And as you mentioned, this goes back several years in terms of relationships. In August of 21, many of us who had spent some time in Afghanistan in one capacity or another, either as a civilian or in uniform, were contacted one way or another and ended up working together as part of a larger effort that started out being known as Digital Dunkirk and then spun off into two larger coalitions that still kind of govern the space to date now, working to get folks out. And I think, each of the other members can speak for themselves, but I think what I recognized, at least between this particular humanitarian mission that we just conducted as compared to Ukraine or Sudan or Afghanistan that preceded that, is a lot of the same, TTPs that were developed for, remote navigation, remote, I guess, life-saving measures as necessary, or survival techniques. And, some of the team members here really went to some extraordinary efforts to make sure that the that folks were taken care of until they could be extracted and evacuated. All of that was developed over time, and I don't think what happened would have been possible 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So this is really the emergence of, I guess, the manifestation of technology and warfare to where it is at this day, to be able to communicate and be able to action things from across the world, which we really, again, were not really possible or feasible during that time. And so I think the skills that were honed over the last couple of crises allowed them to be applied here very quickly. And again, mainly on the technology side, but also some of the sensitive techniques that were used. So, we're also not done. We're also still working Afghanistan. Many of us here on the panel, along with a couple other conflicts. I mean, the last 48 hours, we had another interpreter arrive that we've been working on for the last year or so. That was Jim Sciutto from CNN, his fixer and interpreter. He's trying to get it for 2.5 years. So we spent a little less than last year working to get him out. And Mohammed and his family just arrived in the U.S. about 48 hours ago. So very, very, pointed question, and definitely relates to what we're doing now.
Other panelists care to chime in on that and also to speak to your personal motivations for doing what you do?
I can jump in real quick, just because of the background and the extensive time that I've spent in the military and within special operations, and being on every continent except South America. I've seen kind of the afflicted peoples that we've worked with, whether it's in Africa or the Middle East or Southeast Asia. There's no lack of people to be able to help. It's just what's presented to us and where we can actually be effective. So really, that's kind of what's positioned us. I think across the board, we've seen horrible things within the world, and this is just an outlet and a space where we get to actually make a difference, a positive difference, and a positive impact on people's lives, especially when it gets to be very personal. When it's somebody that we can personalize, it's a U.S. service member, it's their mother, it's their uncle, it's their family members. That makes it more real, makes it more personal, and we get to bring together our network, our experiences, and what we've been able to do before and apply it right here. So I think that's really what drives the whole group, at least myself, especially going forward with this.
Yeah, I'll go next. So I want to begin by thanking the panelists. I think it was just a tremendous experience working with them on something that mattered a lot to us, and especially you, Hope. So as someone that was born and raised in a country that doesn't have a free press, I've certainly appreciated your work in investigative journalism. And I, for one, appreciate you upholding a core principle of our democracy. So thank you for that. So a little bit about myself. I was actually on the other end in an official capacity in Kabul in 2021 during the evacuation. So I was part of the joint task force that was in charge of overseeing the evacuation operation. And I was first exposed to entities like the Special Operations Association of America, and the work that was done by folks like Danielle, in a very different capacity, in the sense that I don't want to knock on the bureaucratic measures that at times result in a lethargic throughput of government work. But this was one of those unique circumstances that there is no pretty way to end a war. And just a surge of evacuees that were required to be extracted, it came down to just not a whole government approach to problem solving, but a whole of society approach to problem solving. And this was one of those rare occasions where the third option in this instance was entities like SOA and others. So that was my first exposure. With regard to your second part of the question as to why folks like me and others on this panel are drawn to this line of work. So I'm a first-generation immigrant, and if my parents were to make a slightly different decision than the one where they applied for the green card lottery system in 2005 and we got accepted, this could very well be me in a country in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world, whether it be stuck in a gray zone conflict or one where U.S. government intervention is just a challenge. And I was exposed to this not just in Kabul, understanding the power of an American passport, but I was also exposed to it in Sudan, where you're given this formal and informal authority to make a decision that hopefully helps out for the greater good of humanity. But at times you're left crippled without all the right bureaucratic channels. So for a lot of us that volunteer, our driving factor is the greater good of humanity, as much as it is protecting and preserving American lives. And lastly, I will say, as proud as I am and others on this panel of having executed this extraction successfully, I don't want our celebrations and or our shedding the light on this success to be conflated for ignoring the fact that there are still 2.2 million people stranded in Gaza currently. There's 130 plus hostages that were kidnapped on October 7th, where there's resolution pending. And then equally as importantly, there's hundreds of more Americans that are either in the docket with entities like the ones that we work with or other organizations. I do want to recognize that. But thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to this dialogue.
And Hope, this is Ben. Thanks for all the work you do, by the way. So I want to clarify, I only served in the 2nd Battalion, 19th Special Forces out of Canova, West Virginia. It's just the National Guard Special Forces, so I don't consider anything special. And I also wanted to say that, as we touched on previously, I do it because I'd hope that somebody would help my family in need. And I'm proud to have served and continue to serve with the current and previous teams. Danielle, that just leaves you.
It does indeed. I'd like to say thank you for having us so much. And anybody here who says that they're not anything special is all of my teammates here who say that they're not anything special are just telling untruths. So I'm really, it's been something very incredible to work with them. I think Omar touched on something. There's no glamorous or pretty way to end a war. I did not serve in, I've not served. I'm not part of the military and I'm not part of this community that they are a part of. I'm a humanitarian in this group. And so I've seen sort of the other side of what happens when people are trying to leave and the end of a conflict. And so that's why I felt that I needed to step up with Afghanistan. And that's what called me to sort of to see what I could do. And I think that Afghanistan was an event that the 20 years was something that had really shaped so many of our lives. And I think that I felt very called to see if I could help in any way that I could. And we all played a very small part. And it was a massive group effort and still is to this day. Not one person has done anything on their own. It's been a huge, huge group effort. Yeah, I just am overwhelmed by being here. So thank you so much.
I guess, Hope, the last piece I didn't hit on is the motivation. And I think we talked about it a little bit when you were, writing the article. I think all of us together that were on here, we're together in group calls or group chats, and we kind of all drew the same conclusion. I think Omar alluded to it as well. You can't do everything, right? You can't fix every situation in the world, but there are certain situations that arise and opportunities present themselves where you can affect it, right? And to Ben's point, we want someone to do that for our mother if it was the other way around. As imagine everyone, what if you could do that and get some help? But we kind of had that. It was bizarre as a reference. I mean, even going through Afghanistan in 21, right? There's after the movie Argo came out, there's constantly movie references, funny things going in the background. In this particular case, where it was a little more somber, you talk about a U.S. service member whose father, died during the event. He was caught in the crossfire and eventually, died as a result of injuries he sustained, during walking out, I believe, in the middle of a firefight. Ben, just correct me if I'm wrong on some of the details. Also want to make sure we're respectful of the family in that sense. But it was just mom that was left, and it was one of those moments we realized, as Omar mentioned, he's a first generation immigrant, so am I. And so are a few others that are on here. And, you don't really have a great network at that point when you're growing up in an environment. Your family's not here. You're by yourself. Junior enlisted in the military. Mom is stuck on the other side of the world behind the front lines in a conflict that you have nothing to do with. And there's no ability to help. And so we just kind of sat there and said, it was that moment, we got to get her out of there. We got to figure it out. And, collectively as a team, we had worked on some other things in Gaza early on, when the war had kicked off, for other NGO workers or Americans who were there that we were able to help. And so this was an opportunity that presented itself, and the team very quickly, assessed the situation, said, "Yep, let's get after it. Let's do it. And let's figure it out." So that was sort of the motivation of the discussion.
Indeed. Well, thank you all so much. Let's drill down into the details of this particular case. So Alex and Ben, you were the first to really touch this case. That was in mid-December. I'm curious what your initial thoughts were when you began to understand the parameters of where Zahra was located, what the dangers were, what the obstacles were, and what the first steps were that you developed to immediately start building a plan to help.
Well, I get the initial contact, letting me know about the situation in general terms, and immediately notified, obviously, so as leadership, what was going on with the organization they're volunteering for. And then Ben and Brian, Danielle and Omar have been, colleagues and friends. Immediately reached out to Ben because we all kind of have our own specific roles within our team that we fill. We all kind of touch everything, but just based on background, people will take the lead in different situations or specify tasks just based on experience. And it's been great because everybody just kind of fell in on whatever that was, and we all just naturally deferred to each other depending on what the situation was. And Ben has been helping to run lead operations with Brian for quite some time, not just here, but in a whole host of crises that we've dealt with. And obviously having capabilities, to help folks there as we had earlier on in the crisis. Ben's obviously the first phone call, apprised him of the situation to get his take as a very senior, experienced operator. As well as on the business side, as you heard earlier. So he kind of wears two hats there, even though he wanted to dismiss it. He's very seasoned, and so to get a solid assessment, what do you think? Is this something that you think is feasible? Just kind of talk through some basics. He's like, "I got it. I'll take it. Let's start the crisis contingency planning now." And so I don't think we spoke for couldn't be more than a minute or two, Ben. Right at that point, it was let's get
That's
moving.
right.
I think that's what it took, right?
Yeah, there was no thought that we couldn't do it. The only thought is that it would take more time than it has taken previously.
And can you outline some of the difficulties, the obstacles, the reason why that was part of the initial assessment? That this is going to take more time. This is going to be a bigger lift.
So I'll let you address that.
Well, I think the location was probably the biggest issue that we had, right? I mean, there are Gaza, as Omar mentioned, about 2.2 million people in total. And when the war kicked off, Prime Minister Netanyahu had his stated goal of the demilitarization of Hamas, which we all collectively knew immediately meant they would have to go on the ground. There's no way you can demilitarize an organization from the air. And whether you agree with how the war has been prosecuted or not, that for the purpose of the discussion of what we're talking about, it was problematic because we knew, that was going to be a massive humanitarian situation, crisis on the ground, and just everything that would come with that. And then the Israelis defined what we'd call like a line of advance, right? And it was south of Gaza City, where Wadi Gaza is, effectively cutting Gaza in half, and then putting a line of tanks and troops, and then sort of encircling Gaza City, and then starting to move methodically through the city. And now we're seeing operations on the southern side of Gaza. At the time when this was happening, Zara and her brother-in-law were in an area that was behind the front line, so to speak, and it was not somewhere where we could easily get to them. And then on top of that, there's still active combat going on. You've already had one relative that has died as a result of being caught in the crossfire. So the location itself was very precarious. And also, as was mentioned, some of the stories, some of the health issues that family members had. And again, be respectful of them. I don't want to get into some of the specifics, but there were ongoing health issues that need to be addressed, and so that presented a time challenge as well. So we didn't have all the time in the world. The location was extremely dangerous given where it was. They were also running very low on water, and at some point they actually ran out. I remember at one point I think they also had uncooked rice was about all they had for food, which made it very, very difficult. And so it kind of required simultaneous courses of action and planning that had to take place. An extraction operation to physically get them from where they were, an evacuation that would legally allow them to leave Gaza, which would then require a different set of approvals and authorities in coordination with different governments. And then there was immediate life-sustaining measures that needed to happen remotely as well to deal with triaging medical issues, as well as to address the lack of water and whatnot. And so that's kind of what we realized right away were the big problems. And first thing that needed to be addressed was trying to stabilize as best as we could the situation where they currently were. And that's where Ben really took the lead on helping to provide some life-saving advice and some survival techniques remotely that I think would probably blow some folks' minds. I remember getting a phone call, hearing about the water situation, and Ben and Brian getting together, being the ever brilliant and ambitious Green Berets that they don't like to talk about being there because they're both humble. Lo and behold, Ben is sending me satellite imagery that he has found and letting me know that there are trees nearby, an orchard that he's identified through which water can be extracted from leaves. and some other techniques, which I'll let him get into because this really was him. But I'm saying that part because I remember reading through the messages. I'm like, it's just really incredible to be able to work with people of this caliber who have this kind of problem-solving ability on the fly, the ability to, deal with massive tech deals during the day and then advise on the consulting side as Ben does, and then be able to turn around 5 minutes later and he's analyzing satellite imagery to make sure that trees nearby a location in Gaza are able to provide water. I mean, it speaks to, I think, just how incredible some of these folks are. So Ben, do you want to take it from there and kind of finish up, because this was really your your effort here that was really incredible to watch.
Yeah, I think it was really a group effort, to be honest. And I just happened to be the guy that spoke first, is all. But yeah, she had some trees nearby. She was able to access those leaves that she's able to condense water from, and then also distill water from brackish or dirty water, if you will, as well. And so it was nothing special. I mean, anybody can find anything about it on YouTube, but we just documented it and sent it to her, and then also explained it to her on the phone. That's basically it.
And Danielle, so as Alex and Ben are triaging the situation, you come in and you are have the humanitarian expertise, and I understand you are in very close contact with Zara, the mother. Can you talk about the role you played there and how important it was to just reassure her and be a point of contact to her, even as sort of this larger plan to get to safety was being developed?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that it was incredibly difficult to connect with people on the ground. So I would speak with relevant family members as possible. One in particular who is incredibly special and dear to our team. I hope that he's watching today and knows how dear he is to our team indeed. I think he does. And so it was really important to liaise. And when we had the opportunity to speak with Sarah on the ground, it was very, very important to be precise, concise, and be able to get the correct information in a way that was calm and measured, to relay that back to people with far more special skills than me. And so yeah, it was really, we wanted to be able to get sort of updates on health, updates on sort of atmospherics and how comms were looking, what the battery life of phones looked like, anything that we would not be able to see just from Google Maps and from just the news, and social media, which was, again, not much because there's a comms blackout. So it was very, very important to speak in a way that was just measured, calm, and concise in order to relay information back to these incredible human beings here.
Thank you. And Brian and Omar, you all are coming in and you have these unique sets of skills. You're developing plans and finding literal ways out, and let alone the teamwork that has to happen to enact these plans. But can each of you talk about how you approached your role and sort of the background you had that enabled you to bring what was needed to that job?
Go ahead, Omar.
No, thank you. I think a key element, and this was unique for me in the sense that the last two times I did this was once in 2023 when I was in Sudan, again in an official capacity, and then in 2021 in Kabul. I think the uniqueness of having to do this from afar is to account for the time-space analysis, as folks with Brian and my background would say in our line of work. But the way we pursued this was to always have a primary, secondary, and a tertiary plan, because the situation on the ground was so fluid in the sense that the moment you finalized a plan, there would be a single piece of coordination that would fall out, and that not at the detriment of somebody's capabilities, but simply because that one individual that was going to help us out was just not available. So through those lenses, what was extremely effective was just us having depth in our planning. And at any given time, we were just sitting on our large screens and looking at a KMZ file trying to plot, again, primary, secondary, and tertiary routes. And then to Danielle's point earlier, I do want to give a huge shout out to the older son, Zara's older son, who is here in the States. I hope as he continues on his journey, not just as an immigrant, as an American, he has a profound sense of appreciation for the role that he played on our team, despite not officially being co-located with us. And I think an important element of his identity that was crucial in this was he went from being the eldest son to overnight being the patriarch of the family. And he had, as we were developing these contingency plans, the ability for him to convey the human element of where his mother currently is at, how she's feeling, whether or not she could move a certain distance. Because again, folks with our background can plot something on a map and say, okay, good. If you move at 3.5 kilometers an hour, miles an hour, whatever it may be for said distance, you can get to X location in 13 minutes, 18 minutes, whatever it may be. But the human element of that interaction is just so crucial. And Fadi just did a phenomenal job of being that conduit between us and the family to continue to feed us that information. And again, as we honor his work, there was a point in time in the operation where there's this relationship of pushing and pulling of information where you're constantly pulling or you're having to push. It became fluid to the extent where he started to pick up on what it is that we would need. And to the trained eye, those are things that, just come as second nature. But for someone with no formal training, that was just beyond admirable. And I just had to make that plug in there because obviously he's not here. But I hope he's watching and he's proud of himself. And he continues to be proud of himself as he takes on additional challenges and tackles any other adversity that life throws at him. But I'll turn it over to Brian to shed some more light on this.
Good. No, I want to shed some light on Omar. Thank you very much. I want to shed some light on the family because that was one of the things that Danielle and I worked on along with the rest of the team was directly engaging with Fadi and also his brother, his younger brother, Raji, who is the U.S. service member, directly engaging with him and knowing that he had communicated through his chain of command as far as his concern about his mom being in Gaza and her being his dependent and being able to take care of his family. So there was definitely some work to be done there, not necessarily just on the coordination side, but also on the personal side. I've dealt with young soldiers going through problems, whether it be children or a marriage or a family. We all have issues in life, and to be able to speak to that kind of one-on-one on a very personal level. And thank you for Danielle for being on the call with me and being able to help with that because having that direct relation, having that direct contact and being able to, ease those concerns, ease the anxiety, and then to give reassurance to the family that, hey, things are being done. We're working with every aspect we can to make sure that they're taken care of, that they can survive the ordeal. Thank you, Ben, and be able to come out on the far end of this and be able to be reunited with their family. So making that direct connection, I think, is critical. That's the human portion, is to be able to make the connection with the family and then use our experiences and expertise to make sure they're taken care of like we would want to take care of our own families.
That's powerful. And I think Alex or Ben said this earlier, that there was never a point at which the conversation was, we can't do this. This is too difficult. The obstacles are too great. But I would love for you all to talk a little bit more about that. What gave you both the confidence that you could see this through and also the determination of this must happen? We can't call it quits on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Danielle had one more thing to say. Didn't you, Danielle, prior to that? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. I'd just love to say one more thing about the communication with the family, and that's from a health perspective as well. When you're dealing with like severe dehydration and whatnot, it's difficult to communicate where you are on the ground and how you're feeling in a way that's sort of sometimes cohesive. And so I just want to again give Fadi a shout out, because you can read your family so much better than anybody else can. And I think that for him to have been able to, as it was pointed out, sort of pull what we needed in a way that, and pick up what was needed prior to us saying anything, and really convey ground truths in an absolutely remarkable way. I get sort of lost for words trying to say what he did. It was truly remarkable and just incredible. Again, we spoke about that concise bit with comms and the lack of comms that was going on for him as well with his mother. And so he was struggling with a very challenging situation, grief, as Omar mentioned. And he was able to sort of still, sort of be concise in these roles and take on sort of this massive leadership role, not only with his family, but with our team as well. And it's just remarkable. And he was able to really do some incredible things. So just wanted to point that out and just say thank you.
I think Danielle's comments were pointed. I'm glad you got a chance to address that, because the work that she does is just, it's without comparison. And I think you were asking about, the evaluation of whether or not we could do this, and the fact, and as Ben mentioned, that there wasn't really a doubt. We like to joke, anything not bound by the laws of physics is subject to change. So it's just a question of time and money, and in some cases permission. It's very much one of those situations here. And so when you look at the situation, do some initial triage, you realize very quickly, in order to get out of Gaza, it's going to require the permission of 2 to 3 governments in this particular case. That's separate from the logistics challenges of planning an operation of this type, as it is, and a humanitarian operation, to be clear, for that matter. And so I think we all started doing our own internal searching and trying to make a determination as to whether we thought it was possible. So, you got into a little bit the operational planning side. We all hopped on calls together to kind of convey what our concerns were. Could they be addressed? What do we think? And just work through that rather quickly. There wasn't any doubt, I think, that we could sort of do it. And so then we all sort of proceeded down different paths, parallel activities that were necessary as part of basic project management, like you would do no matter what it is that you're looking at. In this case, it happens to be an operation, a humanitarian one for that matter. And so some quick triaging with government officials that were involved. So I reached out to one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's spokesmen, who I worked with through the Atlantic Council in the past, to make sure his office was apprised as to what was going on. And then, we didn't do this by ourselves in that sense either. The Arab American Civil Rights League was, played a big role in sort of helping from a legal perspective as well as humanitarian side, and making some human connections that were necessary too. And Alicia Nevis, who works there, is absolutely phenomenal, along with some of her colleagues as well, who were, making sure that the family was taken care of, and then, connecting us with the right government leaders who had already been involved. And so by the end of the initial contact, we had the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs, Andrew Miller, the Chief of Staff to the Secretary of the United States Army, the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Coordinator, a Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian territories, and then the U.S. Defense Attaché in Egypt, join us in some discussions to really figure out, could we do this from a coordination standpoint or at a governmental level, which then began discussions with both the Egyptians and the Israelis afterwards as well. And so within, I'd say, the first couple of days of us getting contact, it became very clear from an operational side, which again, Ben and Brian really took the lead on, along with Omar and myself helping, and Danielle as well. We all had different areas we led in. We realized from an operational perspective, it was feasible. There was a lot of work that we needed to do. It looked like from a government perspective, there was general consensus that yes, this was something that should be done. It just becomes a question of how, and that's just working through the bureaucracy and the mechanics. You can't circumvent law, but you can, help to speed up or bypass bureaucracy and policy when necessary, and that requires some help. I think the last challenge related to that was the fact that you mentioned this really took place over the holidays. So, finding yourself on Christmas Eve as a group that is assembled here, along with senior government officials for that matter, who very easily could have politely said, we're busy, we'll get back to you on Monday. We're spending their holidays, on phone calls and messages with us to run paperwork, to ensure calls were happening between the White House and executive departments and agencies in the U.S. along over to Israel and into Egypt. And it was quite remarkable. It really humanized, faceless government officials that we all hear about. You hear these, grandiose titles of senior officials, the Pentagon or the State Department. They're these anonymous figures. Who are they? Bureaucrat? Do they really care? This was one of those instances where we got to see them in action, and it was absolutely remarkable, the level of dedication, I mean, the concern for the entire time was make sure mom and her brother-in-law get out safely, make sure the service member, the soldier is taken care of, and make sure other siblings who are not in the military are taken care of as well. And that was really, I think, the guiding principle that all of us operate with. We want to do this, the fastest, but the safest way possible to extract them. And I mean, that's actually was funny when we started out, and I'm sure we'll proceed in that direction. Questions at some point later. There was a discussion about, do we go ahead and move forward with some of the operational plans that that were developed by the team, or do we try to allow? Again, there's only so many people operating in Gaza. In this case, it's it's the Israeli Defense Forces because they happen to be in that general vicinity in terms of Gaza City. Potentially have them see if they can affect the situation. And so, that was actually the first choice, if it was possible, to see if that could happen from a safety perspective. No one needs to play James Bond or Jason Bourne. That's not how this works. This is a humanitarian situation, right? And so the goal is to get them out safely. And unfortunately, it didn't quite work or make sense given the circumstances for that to happen. And so then it kind of fell back to us from an operational side to make that happen. So again, foremost was always trying to ensure the safety of the individuals involved. And so when we realized that wasn't going to be possible, then it was really game time from an operational perspective to make sure we had everything set, the logistics, the permissions from 3 different governments, coordinating through the family. Again, Fadi was absolutely incredible in terms of helping to play point for that. And then his other brother Raji, along with other government officials, ensuring that the legal paperwork was going to be set to help. Once she was eventually out of there, and make sure the soldier was taken care of. He was over in Korea, and got brought back early from training. I mean, the number of moving pieces here was really, really remarkable. But seeing the human side of our government officials, again, State Department, Department of Defense, Government of Israel, Government of Egypt, was really just incredible to see, and it really. It made me proud, of my country again to watch this, once again, another crisis. The situation is never perfect, but there's always people who rise to the occasion, and we were really fortunate to have the government officials that we did involved in the situation. I cannot, thank them enough or express just how great they did in this particular crisis.
I just want to add to what Alex said. Impossibility is a concept developed by those unwilling to try, and there's no one here where impossibility ever enters their mind. It was never a thought. That's all I want to say.
And we felt that as well from the people that we worked with within on the government side. I will absolutely in my life never win an Oscar. I can't see that ever happening. But I feel like, if I were to get the chance to make a speech, this is where I would be played off for thanking so many people, truly.
I don't think it can be overstated that this happened over the holidays. This was Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. People did not spend time with their families. They spent time working on this. So I don't think it could be overstated. The holiday season that we typically set aside and remove ourselves from social contacts, remove ourselves from work-related events, work-related anything. And people at very senior levels, the U.S. government took time away from their families and dedicated to doing even what might be considered menial tasks, make sure paperwork got completed to make sure that this family was taken care of. It really was I think, having spent a career in the military and DOD, it was phenomenal to see all that happen.
Another thing that was really, really phenomenal was the way that our team is very great at dropping egos at the door and sort of being quite flat and just sort of letting everybody run and work and do what they do best. But watching that happen on that side as well. And it was refreshing, and it was wonderful, and it was just incredible and inspiring, and really just, it kept us going.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is the whole notion of multilateralism in the region as well. I think collectively as Americans, we have a propensity to view the trajectory of a nation, or to look at current affairs in a nation and either just rule them out or have pre-established, if not biases, then certain slants. And I share that because I think the role of Egypt in this was exceptional, and not from a policy standpoint, but again, from that civil servant standpoint. And because I'll do a shameless plug-in here. I spent a significant amount of time with the Defense Attaché office in Riyadh, and again, the role of the Defense Attaché office and just the Defense Attaché service is another underrated aspect of our national security apparatus. So one particular gentleman and his team, Colonel David Cobbs, who's currently the senior defense official in Egypt, he and his team were just phenomenal. Even at a time when we hadn't necessarily moved our evacuees further south towards the Rafah crossing. He had his team there daily, just on standby, coordinating, setting conditions for if and when that border crossing happens. And then, again, from a conditions-based standpoint, they already had the conditions set to take the mother and her relative straight to a hospital. So I think it's moments like these where we truly need to elevate the alliances that we have, especially in an era where both our soft power initiatives are often under question, our foreign aid initiatives are often under question, and people say, "Hey, what is the efficacy of this?" But I think above all, to the point that Alex and all the others on the panel made, in an era where we're blindly at times pursuing accountability, and in the name of accountability, we end up tarnishing not just the reputation, but the efficacy and the decorum of our public and democratic institutions. This is one of those fine examples where, yes, accountability should be a top priority in our democracy, but let's not tarnish what the people at the end of the day do in these institutions. And I know this is a very first world comment to make that, hey, look, it was a holiday, but yet we had bureaucrats kind of hopping in and responding to these messages and doing their due diligence. Because superficially looking at this, you would say, well, good, that's your job. But again, I think there's this element of almost unjust expectations from public servants where we say, well, good, do your job. Doesn't matter if it's Christmas or not. But I thought that was beyond unique. And for most of us who are in those circles, we just do, and we don't realize how unique it is to have to deliver regardless of what time of the year it is. But again, at the end of the day, despite these titles, these folks still have families. They could be anywhere else than at the office helping out. So I thought that was very unique. And I, for one, will continue to reiterate that no matter what circle or ecosystem that I'm in, that at the end of the day, regardless of what identity you carry, what country you represent, when you're a civil servant, you're truly doing it for the greater good of humanity.
Let me add to that, Omar, because I appreciate that. And I want to bring it down to this team and the team level to the extent of how we were sharing the responsibilities of communication and engagement, because there were even evenings that we set up a rotating watch to make sure people got rest, to make sure that at any time there was like no opportunity for there to be no contact. So there were issues things that aroused that came up that were need to be made aware to the team. We could call everybody else in, but still allow for everybody else to get rest and sleep, because after 2, 3, 4 days of staying on this 24/7, constant alert, constant communications, constant work of trying to facilitate this to happen, people were starting to burn out and to really struggle with fatigue. So it actually came to a point where, in the evening time East Coast, we were having to, set up a watch so that, people could actually get some rest and have some time away from purely focusing on what we were doing with the family. Not to say that it didn't want to deserve it, but we also didn't want to stay this very heightened level of vigilance to where everybody was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, focused on this. They could step back, get some sleep, renew themselves. They come back in refreshed and bring in their full selves versus being depleted as we're going forward.
I did see some pretty unbelievable sleep charts on the order of, I think, 5 minutes a night. Please, if you're in the audience, know that you can ask questions, submit a question for this wonderful panel at askac.org. So if you haven't had a chance to do that, please go ahead and do that right now. So underpinning everything that you all have just talked about, you have to have some trust and rapport to get people to even pick up the phone or answer their email when you come to them with something of this import, and they have to understand that you know what you're doing and what your motivations are. You're networking with civil and military officials at very, very high levels, and they're committing, as you said, extreme level of effort to get this done. So for everyone in this panel, how are those relationships built over time? And what role did that foundation of trust and rapport play in being able to execute something like this in the first place? And Omar, you've talked about this a little bit. Let's go ahead and start with you on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the umbrella organization that a lot of us either volunteer with or operate under played a colossal role in having that good relationship. So I'll touch upon, I guess, organizational relationships here, but also the relationships that we have to in an ad hoc manner, build with the people that we interact with, whether it's advocates, the lawyers that are representing certain clients, whatever it may be. So as for the Special Operations Association of America, I felt as though the efficacy of their work during the Afghanistan evacuation made it easy to, I don't want to undermine it, but it made it achievable to have that network. And there's something to be said about building a network, but then continually nurturing it. And with efforts across the globe, that network had been nurtured. So from an organizational relationship building standpoint, that was very effective. And for us, as we got linked up with Fadi and we got linked up with Zahra, we were very deliberate to ensure that we're prioritizing. Again, we've thrown the term the human element around a lot. And it's not something that a lot of these folks on this panel, this wasn't the first time we had to establish rapport, nurture it, build it, and then act on it. So and I was just reflecting on this recently, where every time we got in touch with a pertinent stakeholder, whether it was a family member or somebody forward that was assisting us, we didn't just straight jump to an ask. We had a process in place, and the process was rooted in compassion and empathy. And following genuine inquiry is when we got to the meat and potatoes of the evacuation or the extraction, however you want to coin it. But I do think it has a lot to say, not to the work experience, the personal and professional of the people on this panel, but what genuinely brings a lot of these folks to this line of work. It's not transactional. It's not a vehicle for social mobility. It is something that we carry. I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody else, but for me to have left uniformed service and to want to continue doing this in a volunteer capacity is, to a certain degree, moral injury and residual trauma that I carry from not having done enough while on the ground. Alex mentioned, the old adage about permission and authority. I felt as though I had immense informal authority when I was in Kabul, and the same with when I was leading an interagency team in Sudan. But there are still confines under which you have to operate. And you almost have just as folks in the corporate sector would have a fiduciary responsibility to their clients, I have a responsibility to the taxpayers of America to not completely go off the rails. But when you're doing this work in an official capacity, I think seldom do you realize that when you're going to walk away from it, you're going to carry the moral injury and the residual trauma of not having helped enough people, despite having built the trust with them on the ground. So for me, it was a lot of that residual trauma that leads me to a rational response to these events. I certainly would like to believe I'm not illogical and or irrational when it comes to providing this kind of support. But I think it's a mix of circumstances. But the common denominator here is our desire to want to do this. It's not just our professional experiences that inform our trust building mechanisms. But I'll turn it over to my colleagues and allow them to shed some more light on this.
Yeah, I think in terms of authorities, as Omar was just mentioning, Part of that did come from work experience, I think, is having an understanding of the national security decision-making process and how that works and what government leaders need and don't need in order to take action, and trying to limit the information that we share to what is pertinent as well as the asks for what is actually necessary. It's a rare opportunity to have folks engaged at that level. This is a rare situation in general terms. And so trying not to overburden government officials, but at the same time ensure they have enough information to make decisions, it's a delicate balance, right? And it is something I think you framed it correctly by asking about our collective experience in Afghanistan, which is where we started. So that does come, I guess, with some of the, I mean, again, SOA also being a nonprofit as well and taking donations. We are sort of public as an institution, and so are some of the folks who work there, like myself as a volunteer, as a board member. So we're Googleable in that sense, or somebody can look and say, okay, these folks are legitimate. They've done work in the past. So that did help from a credibility standpoint. And then also the uniqueness of the situation in the sense that there has been very publicly mentioned, there are no U.S. government or military forces anywhere near Gaza for that matter. And so there isn't anyone on the ground to be able to go and get Zara and her brother-in-law. And since there isn't anyone there, there's this sort of natural void that's developed, and it is what it is. It's not a negative sense or a knock at someone for what I'm about to state, but if you look at it, the State Department engages in non-combatant evacuation efforts, or also assisting folks who are trying to self-evacuate from situations. You'll see them send out warnings when things are getting bad. Please leave the country. Inevitably, somebody's always stuck for one reason or another. It happens, right? Now, on the far other side of that is when someone's taken hostage, in a either criminal or terrorist hostage taken abroad, where perhaps there's a Department of Defense option to do a hostage rescue operation, right? But those are both inherently governmental functions for things that happen. In the center is an individual, or individuals for that matter, who need to get out. They need to get out of wherever they are and get somewhere. That requires assistance with paperwork in some cases, language, logistical support in some cases to get them where they need to go, sometimes financial. And sometimes it's as easy as just giving basic directions and translating. Here's what the government means when they say X to you. This is what they're actually looking for. And in other cases, it's a bit more extreme and where we actually have to prepare the logistical side of it to get folks out. And so it's humanitarian. I mean, a lot of folks will hear this. There were some sensational headlines that came out about this, super secret operation in Gaza. This is a humanitarian operation at the end of the day. This is a nonprofit organization. No one's out there playing, James Bond. That's not how this works. We stay in our lane. We know where the lines are between government and civilian, appropriate actions. And this is, again, a very rare circumstance. The last piece I wanted to hit, just because it's tied to it, wasn't to the original question. You'll still see stats coming out that there's Americans who are still left. Why was this case special compared to others? This is, again, not unique to Gaza, but we've seen in Afghanistan and other places. You'll have families where, 3 of the 4 people are American citizens or green card holders, but the 4th member doesn't have the paperwork, doesn't have a visa, doesn't have a passport. You can't circumvent the law, right? There's still certain things that need to happen. And so the State Department will make whatever efforts they can to try to expedite for those folks on the ground. But that prevents folks from leaving. So yes, there are still people here. In this particular case, again, in terms of situation, legalities, authorities, everything lined up for something that could be actioned. It just became a question, is there someone or something or an institution who's capable of doing so? And that's where, again, we plug in, but as part of a coordinated effort with the government. And that's where we're sort of working together in that sense, not usurping government authority, not overstepping, but providing the humanitarian capacity on the ground to affect that self-evacuation. And then the government was able to do what was necessary to help coordinate with other governments, as well as to support our efforts and make sure that leaders were aware. So again, very unique circumstances. And this wasn't sort of picking or choosing. Yes, we were all deeply, I think, affected by the fact this was a service member's mother, but it's also a human situation, right? This is Palestinian-American, first-generation immigrants whose mother is stuck over there. Can we do something about this? Is it in one of those categories where we have the ability to affect it and just everything happened to line up? And that, therefore, I think we felt we all had no choice. This is like, we need to do this. And it's because we want to, as Omar said, right? We've all been trained in one capacity or another by taxpayers, whether that's an international institution like UNHCR, like Danielle mentioned, or the military, the rest of us are in other civilian capacities. Somebody's made an investment in us. They've given us some training, some skill sets. And if you have an opportunity to use that and pay it forward, even though you're no longer in uniform, I think we have an obligation to do that. Just like, I had a grandmother survive World War II because she was hidden in the attic of a Catholic home in Holland, during the Holocaust. And there was, she reminded me before she passed, there's an appropriate role for civilians to play during a war. And this is one of those situations where that's exactly what this was.
I would like to make it slightly simpler. in my answer and say that I think it's a motto that I certainly say to myself, but one that I've seen everybody here carry, which is work hard, be kind, lead loyally, and give back where you can, and just really keep your head down and be mission driven. And so I think that that really helps in building trust. This community is small, and when I say this community, though I'm not part of their community, I've certainly been around their community a lot as a humanitarian in certain non-permissive environments and conflict zones. And so we become almost like a family, and you can smell who's doing what. And I think that it really is important to just follow that motto and be simple in that, because at the end of the day, your reputation will follow you in a small community. And so it's really important to just sort of be kind, lead loyally, and be mission driven at the end of the day. And that really goes as well, we've moved around a lot, all of us, I think. And so it really helps in sort of in maintaining relationships with people all around the world. You never know when that might come in handy.
I want to say, sorry, Ben, go ahead, please.
No, you go.
I was going to transition to the next thing. So if you have a comment, please go ahead and make it.
No, go ahead.
Just to Omar's reference to moral injury, this panel is being extraordinarily humble about their contributions. But the choice to look at people in danger and experiencing suffering and get involved and then feel that moral obligation to help is a weighty one. And I just want to impress on anyone listening that these panelists, they choose to be involved. They've chosen to be involved for a while now, and they carry the weight of that every day. And because of that, many people have been able to find safety who might not otherwise have. I wanted to, as we're kind of coming closer to the conclusion of this panel discussion time, and before we open for questions, the question that I've always come back to and talked about in the past a little bit with Alex and with others is, this small group of people who have demanding full-time jobs and yet are doing this kind of on an ad hoc basis as they can and when they can, and at the expense of their sleep. Is there a way to extend this out or make this bigger, or take this model, what you all are doing, and systematize it or make it something that can reach more people? Or is it necessarily something that civilian volunteers have to do just as they're able in these fairly loose networks, as in this case that we've been talking about? I would love your thoughts about that. What's next, or what we can kind of learn from this system that you all have developed.
So glad you asked that. I'm going to throw it immediately to Omar and or Alex, because we speak about it a lot, and I think they can put it very eloquently.
Omar, you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the things that folks on this team often talk about is, speaking of tendencies that we possess as Americans, when it comes to repealing and reforming something, we almost always have a propensity to want to repeal things, right? The FDA makes a mistake, let's just get rid of it. And I say this in the least partisan manner possible. I think collectively, we are of the opinion that as conflict in the gray zone becomes a more common thing with the rise in great power competition, I don't want to turn this into a lawfare or a warfare conference or panel, But I think it's rather evident that great power competition is on the rise, and typically you don't see a pound for pound interaction with great power militaries as these competitors are on the rise. You start to see more shadow activity in these gray zones, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, pockets of the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, wherever it may be. And a lot of folks are either practitioners or students of international relations on this panel. So we wholeheartedly understand that there are limitations to the authorities that Alex alluded to earlier. So one of the things that we've thought about is how do we formalize not necessarily the practice of third-party interventions like ours, organizations like ours, but how do we establish a more formidable connecting file with the government to enable future extractions to happen with a little bit more ease. And I place added emphasis on the term a little bit more ease because we would be naive as professionals, former military officers, former humanitarians, current humanitarians, to associate the term full ease and full fluidity during these very contentious extractions and or friction-induced scenarios. But I do see in the long term an avenue, hopefully, under the federal government, whether it's housed under the DoD, the National Security Council, in conjunction with the intelligence community, to form a variation of a fusion cell that interacts and or connects with organizations like ours to make these things a little bit more achievable, a little bit more fluid. But I think Alex, given his background in the Department of Defense, and then just in these ecosystems, I feel as though is in a far better position to speak more eloquently on it. But this is something we often talk about in this group as to how we can shape the future of these extractions, because gray zone conflict is not going anywhere anytime soon, and neither is the ability for a government, specifically the American government, just to intervene in an ad hoc sense, albeit in a Title 50 or Title 10 authority. Those authorities are tough. Bureaucracy isn't sexy, but it's a necessary evil. So all that said, I'll turn it over to Alex and see what he has to say.
That quote better end up on LinkedIn somewhere. That was amazing. I love it. I mean, much to Omar's point, I mean, there is some past precedent for a relationship between a nonprofit or a coalition of nonprofits engaged in this type of work. To have a formal relationship with the government. Afghan Evac Coalition, which was founded by Sean Van Diver and a number of others in the wake of the Afghan withdrawal, sort of bring together a number of the groups that were operating in the space, did actually establish a memorandum of understanding with the State Department for how they would function or interact with that in a government agency. Other ideas have been tossed out in the past of, should there be like a State Department Reserve Corps for folks who can be activated during crisis or contingency planning purposes? But there are some practicalities that need to be addressed, as Omar mentioned again, when it comes from a titling authority standpoint. And from those of you who are not familiar with what that means, if you're joining from the outside, when you conduct actions on behalf of the United States government, you have to have a titled authority in the law that allows you to do what it is that you're doing, right, or inherited power from the Constitution. And so, under whose authority or power or titling would a group of individuals, be granted to be able to do sort of what we did here in the situation? So if you take that as a use case example, building out a network of folks operating inside a third country, liaising with foreign governments to be able to do that, interacting with, with the interagency on the U.S. side, it takes a decent amount of authorities and trust to be able to do that. And again, in this case, because we've all been there from the national security space, we understand how the process works. Knowing how process works allows you to either play within it or to go around it when necessary without circumventing the law. There's still, again, you have to be able to do that and know where the boundaries are. So it's very weird, requirement of the knowledge and the experience from times in government, and then to be able to use that same tradecraft, but then also not have the same restrictions of bureaucracy. So it's kind of a trade-off, right? There's no restrictions on the bureaucracy provided what you're doing is legal because this is humanitarian in that sense. But then again, if you're in government trying to coordinate this, there are some times where a natural restriction is in place. So I think looking at some of those situations, like Afghan evac and how that played out, some lessons learned there, potentially a reserve corps on the State Department side, or whether it's a joint task force that stood up, even if it's reserve or whatnot, bringing in some folks who serve in government institutions, augmented by folks from the outside. Any one of those things I think is possible. Otherwise, I think it'll continue to be NGOs playing in that middle space between, State Department official function and then, God forbid, Department of Defense rescue capabilities as necessary to help folks. And I think a lot of us are willing to do it. I mean, If we look at the Afghan situation, this case was small, right? There's 5 of us you see here on the screen as team members. In the case of Afghanistan, I mean, there's still thousands of people who are actively volunteering on a daily basis to try to affect the more than 160,000 people who remain stranded in Afghanistan when you take interpreters, base or embassy workers and their family members. It's 160,000. So, I mean, the numbers are astronomical. There are people who are willing to do the work. It just becomes a matter of what's practical from a structural standpoint for how that could play out over time. But as we do at the Atlantic Council, this is a thinking institution, as we like to call it, as a think tank, right, where we help to develop some policies. So I think you can probably expect some follow-on work as to some potential policy prescriptions for what that might look like. And not so different than that. I mean, that's the same thing. The council as fellows, right? This is also a volunteer institution, unless you're a full-time member of the staff, or if you're engaged to do something in a paid capacity. And people do it for the same reason, right? And affecting policy or attempting to prescribe some to help address situations in people's lives abroad is a large motivation for folks who are at the council, because they want to see a better world, safer, peaceful, prosperous, where people are not being harmed. And sometimes that also requires a little bit more than that. And in this particular case, it required working with some teammates to help affect the situation overseas. And when given the opportunity to do so, I think we will continue.
Finally, before we open for questions, I wanted to ask about what you're currently working on. I know some of this is sensitive, but I also know that cases continue to come across your desks, and you're still working to get people out from Gaza and that part of the world, and also from Afghanistan, as Alex alluded to. So can you talk about your current work and sort of the ongoing nature of what you do?
Ben, Brian, I'll defer to you two gentlemen.
Ben, can you talk about it?
Yeah, I was just going to say that just standard evac stuff. We are currently working on certain situations, if you will, but it's just standard evac stuff. That's all I have to say. Anybody else?
Well, I think I hope you had talked about the moral push to do this, and I think there's no lack of conflict areas around the world where people are in positions where they need to have help, whether they're American citizens or our allies or just people in general. So there's no lack of areas to where we can be able to help. It's just a matter of what come across our desk, what we actually had the opportunity to be able to be involved with, and who we can help. I'm not going to say it's happenstance or just coincidence, but what gets presented before us, we try to action anything and everything we can to make a difference. We've done that throughout our military careers. It's carried over into our professional and civilian lives. Where we can make a difference, where we can have an impact is where we try and go and do what we can, when and where we can.
I think to add just a little more color, there are active cases, as you were mentioning, as Ben mentioned as well. The specifics are still sensitive, just given, I mean, if you can take the nature of this case that we're talking about now, it's not unique in that sense in terms of sensitivity, just the circumstances change. But active between South America, Africa, the Middle East, we get outreach on a regular basis, whether it's from journalists, members of Congress, individual families. People sort of find their way to you, especially after the public nature of the Afghan withdrawal, where again, just tying it back quickly, as you mentioned before, how do you develop that relationship with government? Sometimes it's a matter of happenstance. There's a crisis, people step into the void. You do okay work, and people will remember that. They'll be able to see a news story. And I think Fadi and Raji very, very smartly determined that they needed a little bit more attention on the situation, because I don't think they were quite getting what it was that they needed or who to turn to. Again, as first generation immigrants like myself, Omar, others are on here. Like, where's your support system? Where do you go? And it's one thing I've noticed doing this work for the last 3-4 years, in addition to time in government. There are about 10 people in Washington who can pick up the phone and move heaven and earth. They work 60 hours a week, and their agenda and schedule is set for them. The only time that changes is when the press takes a magic spotlight and shines it on a policy situation or a crisis that needs to be addressed. And all of a sudden, focus and attention moves to where it needs to be to get things affected. And Fadi very smartly, went ahead and did that, which then was able to start a chain of events, which allowed us to get involved. And they graciously allowed us to help them. They didn't know us from a hole in the wall either, so it required some trust extension as well. You can imagine this is your mother after your father has died, who is trapped in a war zone behind the front lines, and you've got a bunch of people who you don't know offering to help you from the other side of the country or the other side of the world. And that takes a decent amount of trust, as you know, as a human being, and being able to convey that back. And so, we built the team together collectively, as Ben likes to mention, modeled sort of on the OSS World War II, teams that then, were the forefathers, I think, for Army Special Forces, in terms of language, logistics, HR, HR. I'm sorry, Danielle was about to say human rights. Sorry, not that side, not the traditional HR corporate side. Legal, government, language, and cultural capabilities. And so, when selecting teammates, we have a bunch of folks we've worked with over the years. We looked at the situation, said, kind of what do we need? And, these are the right folks to pull together the complementary skill sets to just kind of make it happen. And so Ben likes to remind us that it happens naturally because it's a process we go through, but it does tie back to something that's more formal and sort of how we founded ourselves as an organization. Ben, since that's your usual, I stole your thunder there. Do you want to add or elaborate on that?
I just want to say that this is the right team, Hope. FYI, anybody watching, these are the right people.
As the HR professional in the group, and I'm going to say it now as an HR professional and a human rights professional too, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that while we were absolutely all very, very touched by this being a service member's family, I personally also would like to just make a note and say that all lives are very equal within this situation across the world in conflicts. And so I would be remiss to say that status and value of humans here is not, we shouldn't devalue one human because they have a different, they have sort of a different status and are elevated in a certain way, in a certain manner. Though, of course, it was very important and it did touch all of us. And I want to make that very clear. And I want to shout out again to this family and what they went through and what they've done.
I think the last piece I want to hit on, just to touch on what Danielle said, to build on it. If you look at this, these are Palestinian-American first-generation immigrant Muslim family that's here. We also earlier on had Jewish families that needed to be helped there, other families in Afghanistan or in South America. Religious, ethnic, cultural, none of that matters. These are human beings who need, help, and that doesn't matter to us. We're not a party to any of the conflicts that are going on. We are a nonprofit NGO and it's dedicated to humanitarian operations. So the connection back to the United States is obviously important to us, and from a legal perspective for how people can travel, that obviously matters. But those aren't things that we take into account. It's that, everybody's a human being and they have a right to live. And if there's anything we can do to try to help that situation or make somebody's life better, I think that's what we're all here for. Everybody has their own thoughts and views on different conflicts, whether it be this one or the next, and right and wrong. But at the end of the day, that's not why we came together to get into a philosophical debate about a conflict. It was, there are people who need help, and if we have the ability to affect it, that's what we're going to do.
Brian, did I see you have some thoughts on that?
No. I just want to say that operationally, one thing that I want to make sure that we emphasize is that everybody in this team was always actively involved, and there was never a point where somebody's like, well, what can I do? Where do I need to fit in? It was very, very natural as how this team fell together. And I can't emphasize that enough. The team and the people that are presented here on this panel, not even by choice. It's almost well, I'll go back to coincidence and happenstance, right? That everybody just kind of fit together, and the differences that we have kind of meshed very well, so that strengths and weaknesses were compensated for and taken care of, and that holistically this team was able to operate from on the ground through the highest levels of U.S. government collaboration. So, or government collaboration, not just necessarily the U.S., but foreign government collaboration as well. So I can't take away from the way that the team and the individuals work together to make this happen. It couldn't have happened without everybody else being on this team and working together.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions from the audience. If not, I have lots more. I can keep you here all day by myself easily. Okay. I'll wait and see if we get any questions, but in the meantime, I'd like to back up to the operation itself and talk about the conclusion. Again, I'm aware that there are lots of details that you cannot supply. However, I'm interested in the emotion of it. You know, you've been working on this case for weeks, and finally a path comes through where you've got the people and the window of time and the security that you need to execute this. Can you just take me through sort of the beats of how you were monitoring it and what that emotion felt like and what it the emotional weight of finally hearing that these two family members are safely across the border and you've seen their picture and they're smiling. Shall we start with Ben this time?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, obviously everybody was excited when they exited the Palestinian side of the Rafah Gate. Outside of that, though, everything was happening so fast and fluid that there really wasn't time to think about anything else other than to make sure that you know, we did what we were supposed to help get them out, and that was it, from my perspective.
Happy to share my perspective next. I went and actually made myself another cup of coffee. I wanted to make sure that from a health perspective, everything had been taken care of. I wanted to make sure that until everything had been checked and everything was thoroughly done, which was incredibly handled by the Egyptian receiving team from the US Embassy. It was all sorted, and and then I could finally take a breath. And then my next emotion was how are Fadi and Raji feeling? And that was how my concern. And once I had heard from them and spoken to them, finally took a breath and took a nap.
I think, well, I guess from an emotional perspective, I think you alluded to sleep, which was quite funny. I think the first emotion everybody was experiencing at that point was just exhaustion, which is both a state of being and an emotion. I think sleep averages for that week, actually the final night, I actually needed a couple extra hours because I was just done. I couldn't have gone to bed before that. And Ben eventually just told me basically just quiet, just go sleep a couple hours and come back. I'll take the watch, which you can expect from incredible teammates like this. It was sort of overwhelming. It's over the holidays, which are already, got family around, everything else. I mean, at one point, Christmas Eve, we're all on calls, we're all talking together and, running paperwork and everything else. I mean, Southern Italy or Italy in general, you have a tradition. We make 7 fishes on Christmas Eve because you don't eat meat. And so I cooked for, I don't know, over a dozen people. And then, 2:30 in the morning, we're all starting again, the next day for for the rest of the week. So, you catch yourself feeling a little emotional, and then I think Danielle was so spot on with the way that she framed it. You realize it's not about you, right? This was about a family, and more importantly, another human being, a mother, a wife, now a widow, unfortunately, and the sister-in-law to a brother-in-law who's also there with her, whose lives were deeply affected by this. And so anytime you sit there and you're like, I'm tired or this or that, as I like to refer to it, throwing myself a pity party, it just takes a little I think awareness of why you're doing this in the first place, right? That being overtired but sitting on a couch where it's nice and safe and warm with access to running water and food, where buildings aren't being bombed around you, your family members aren't dying in crossfire from combat. You try to keep focus on what's important there, and what this family went through is a lot. And as Omar mentioned earlier, they're one of 2.2 million folks who are there in the combat zone now, where the war is taking place. Where Israel is prosecuting a war to demilitarize Hamas, there are civilians on the battlefield, whose lives are being impacted. And so we try to be mindful of our, fellow Americans, fellow citizens, and what it is that they're going through. But you do catch yourself once in a while forgetting that, getting excited or, tearing up or tired or whatever else. But eventually somebody reminds you, hey, get back to work. So I think we were pretty good about keeping each other honest that way.
I'm going to jump in there. We actually do have a few questions, and some of these are really good. Here's one from a watcher. Can you describe any remarkable moments or acts of bravery that stood out during the process? of rescuing the US soldier's family. For anyone who'd like to take it.
Any moments that stuck out? You said, I'm sorry, just to be clear, you said any moments in particular that stuck out during the course of it?
Any moments that stood out or acts of bravery?
I think, well, the bravery, I mean, we speak as the individuals involved. I mean, we're sitting back here on a couch somewhere. Zara and her brother-in-law, being willing to come out and engage with a group of people that they don't know and get into vehicles and be transported in the middle of a war zone after your husband died in a crossfire for what had taken place, and you're middle bombed out buildings. People forget that the valor was not any of us on the screen here. The heroism and everything took place, as it has in every situation like this that I've participated in the last few years. It is local nationals on the ground who make things happen, who take all of the risk. And in this case, Zara and her brother-in-law, right? Like they decided, hey, we want to live, we want to give this a shot, and they decided they were going to do that. And so, you think of medical situation, the crisis going on around them, being a recent widow, having family members die, the emotions, the lack of sleep, no food, and still being willing to do that, knowing that that could happen. I mean, I haven't met Zara, but if you think about the situation I just described, she must be a truly remarkable woman, her and her brother-in-law. So to me, it was the resiliency of that family and what it is that they went through. And, Fadi and his brothers never giving up hope, trying every avenue possible. It really spoke volumes about who they are as people.
A moment that stands out is just it was such a dynamic situation. There were many, many pieces to this puzzle that had to line up. And at one point, certain pieces were not. And so we had to get really innovative in a very old school way by sort of sourcing old school methods of transportation, including or what we would consider old school methods of transportation in the US. And so sort of donkey carts and calculating the speed. And it was quite an effort on our side, but to then be on the other side, hearing that that's what was going to happen when you have been in quite a situation for a long time. Your health is not great. You're exhausted. You're very, very, very dehydrated and whatnot. That's an act of bravery to even hear that, I think. And so yeah, I think just that stands out in my mind and will never leave me.
Since the two of them don't like to mention having the three of them running operations there, I think stood out to me was some of the work that Ben and Brian did, keeping the folks alive that I mentioned before. So survival techniques, you can imagine pick up your phone, you got a day job and you get a message from Ben. I've addressed the water situation, figured out how to, provide directions for water purification from halfway around the world, mentioning, finding tree orchards via satellite imagery, communications methods. I don't think there are more resourceful human beings on the face of the earth than U.S. Army Special Forces folks. No offense to my favorite Marine here who's on as a raider, no, but the special operations community in general, and just watching the ingenuity of the folks here, come up on the fly with the way of to solve things and just get it done. And then again, being in a work meeting, you pick up the phone and there's no tone or context to a message, and all of a sudden you miss some traffic and you see conversations from Danielle when we're all like, what are we going to do for backup plans, this or that? Have you considered X? And of course, now all of a sudden you're literally seeing calculations, as she mentioned, for what is the average speed for a donkey cart in a particular area when you need potential backup, movement options, this or that. So it's, I think the ingenuity of my other teammates here and the stuff they brought to the table, for me personally, was very remarkable to be able to see and organically integrate that into an operations plan for backups. Was simply incredible to watch. And then Omar obviously stepping in a whole host of situations, but between experience, cultural, linguistic capability, and just being able to solve in a number of those areas. For me, again, it reminds me of why this was a team effort, right? As Danielle mentioned, I think early on, this couldn't have been done by any individual that was on here, and it really required all of that, to come together. So for me, it was very humbling to get to see these guys in action.
And I just want to reiterate that I particularly didn't do anything special. I know my name was mentioned by Alex. I just supported the great team that we have, and that's it.
Okay, message received. Nobody did anything special.
Okay, Ben,
You all are very humble. I've got another good question here from a listener. or a watcher. In the context of the Gaza conflict, how can individuals or organizations outside the region contribute to humanitarian efforts? And what role do you see for international collaboration in addressing the crisis?
It's an incredibly thoughtful and detailed question. Do you mind repeating it, Hope? Sorry.
Absolutely. In the context of the Gaza conflict, how can individuals or organizations outside the region contribute to humanitarian efforts? And what role do you see for international collaboration in addressing the crisis?
Sure. I think there's a couple, Danielle, I don't know if you want to take that from the HR perspective you mentioned. There's a number of NGOs that are operating on the ground, trusted institutions. So whether that's the World Food Program that's run by Cindy McCain, whether that's, Doctors Without Borders who are operating there still, whether that's the International Red Cross. There's a number of institutions who could take donations. If folks are looking for things they could do to volunteer. As you can see, we're all here on screens, and by background, you can tell we're not in the middle of Gaza. So in terms of going somewhere and doing something, it's not sort of practical. But there are institutions where people can plug in that sense and be able to volunteer and help. And it does play, I think, a sort of a critical role. And I think we discussed now from a logistics perspective what an institution like ours can do, but there's others who do different types of humanitarian work. And Danielle, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, given your experience, because it's an immigration crisis as well.
Yes, and I think that, well, first of all, I'd just like to say that no contribution is too small. I think a lot of people feel quite overwhelmed in such a large, when they see something so huge going on, but truly nothing is too small, whether it's a couple of dollars donated or whether you sort of ask if an organization needs just sort of admin work done, right? Yeah, there's really nothing too small to be done. Let me think about the other part, and I'm going to kick it over to Brian for this next piece.
I think that's the big thing is that, yeah, there's the opportunity to work with other governments that we've been able to bring to the table. But I think from a policy standpoint and how we address this it's one thing for the U.S. government, U.S. State Department to be focused on, U.S. citizens, and other governments to be focused on their own citizens. But there's some collaborative efforts that could be happening here that I don't think are yet. For us as a nonprofit, a lot of this has to come from the donor side. There's plenty of willingness, there's plenty of expertise, there's plenty of network that can be thrown at problems. But without the other resources that are greatly needed, it's a challenge, if not impossible, for us to be able to effectively execute change like we want to, and be able to impact these families and help with these evacuations. So that's a big piece for us as far as a nonprofit, is being able to have the resources to do that. But then I think there's also the policy side that needs to be addressed as well.
And just very quickly, the only thing I would add on to that, and again, having been in an official capacity in these zones, in these conflict zones, there's almost a sense of folks wanting to do something. And I feel like everybody on this panel admires that desire. But at times that desire also creates a bottleneck effect in areas where you have to think of it. This is a very military term, but we call it an RSO&I. It's reception, staging, onward integration, and movement. So at times it's almost wise to rely on pre-existing networks. And as my colleagues alluded to, sometimes policy and raising funds is a far better option. However, if you do your stakeholder analysis and realize that there are pre-existing NGOs and or nonprofits that don't have certain resources or abilities where you would help them scale said resources and abilities, then sure, get involved. But I genuinely believe, again, this has been touched on this panel earlier about checking your egos at the door. And I think it's no surprise that a lot of times well-intentioned folks at times do get blinded by this inherent desire to do well. So I would answer that question and provide some unsolicited feedback by saying that let's look at what already exists and try to reinforce that from afar instead of creating a bottleneck effect. And it just creates an additional burden at times for the governmental institutions to have to, I mean, the more stakeholders there are, the more entities you need to shepherd them. So just an element that I struggled with in Afghanistan, where there were very well put together organizations like SOA and other emerging evac coalitions that had formed that I was working with as a military officer. And then there were just random entities that would land and say, hey, I need about 120 people put on this plane. And it's like, well, where are you going to go? I mean, there's some due diligence that I then have to do as an American military officer. So just another factor to take into consideration.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, I know there's more to say on that, but we are totally at the end of our time. And I just want to thank you all so much. It's an honor to share this virtual panel space with you. For those watching, I really encourage you to check out the reporting. There's also an essay that Alex wrote about the evacuation effort that you can find at the Atlantic Council website. And continue to follow the great work of the Special Operations Association of America. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.